kind of, get into, I guess you could call it applied existentialism or deep ethics, the school of existential philosophy that was advanced by Jean-Paul Sartre, Viktor Frankl, and several other figures in the 20th century. Um, Yesterday, it was kind of interesting thing. There was an article published about Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, but also a very talented existential philosopher and psychologist. He had a big impact on the field of psychology and philosophy, existential philosophy for that matter. His major work was Man's Search for Meaning, certainly within the wheelhouse of existentialism. How do you deal with the question of the meaning of existence in the face of what Viktor Frankl describes as the three kind of difficult issues that we face every day in our life. One is the issue of pain. We're human beings with flesh and bone, so we have pain of various types. The other, he argued, is guilt and regret, which comes from the fact that, every day we have to choose, make thousands of choices every day, some of them seemingly small, others seem small, but they actually have a big impact. And that leaves us with guilt and regret. And the third component of the human condition, he argued, is the question of loss, the bittersweet aspect of life, whereby we love people, but we know in our heart of hearts that, that comes with a certain pain because we're finite, So in the face of this, Viktor Frankl argued that we should have what he calls tragic optimism. Why? Well, because we are capable, even within the backdrop of these three components of our lives, the existential condition of humanity, to establish a life of meaning for ourselves and for those, we love. Excuse me just one second. I have to just get my tea. And so it's kind of interesting to me that existentialism, of all the courses offered in college departments, it's probably the most popular. And it's a good reason. There's a good reason for that. Most existential philosophies deal with, everyday life and what we experience therein. If you think about it, love, the core component of that is, the risk that we take in loving someone, the risk that we take in being vulnerable with them, and the possibility of loss. So right off the bat, some of the most important things in our life are existential. And, the existential vantage point is unique, for each individual, and sets up, as Viktor Frankl and others see it, the necessity for creating, meaning for ourselves. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, as I said, and a Holocaust survivor. He died fairly recently, 1970. And as I said, his major work was Man's Search for Meaning. He was in Vienna at a time when Vienna was the focus of intellectual life in the early part of the 20th century. Great thinkers, scholars, philosophers, Freud, for example, were located in Vienna, and lots of informal visits happened amongst these, kind of towering figures. And so, Viktor Frankl is a contemporary of the philosopher I want to talk about today, and that's Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Sartre was also born in 1905 and was an immensely talented individual. He wrote a biography of his life, and it was so well received that he actually won the Nobel Prize for it. Um, in it, he talks about his journey, his discovery of himself and his self-image. One day he saw his image in a mirror and he was horrified. He thought he looked grotesquely ugly. And he, didn't shy away from that, but he kind of enfolded it into his biography, you see, and certainly people were attracted to something other than his physical features, because when he passed away in 1980, he had such a massive turnout. All of the youth in Paris virtually showed up. He was young at heart and supported young people's causes from birth really to death, and was particularly keen on human liberation in all its forms. He really despised ideologies of every sort, all kinds of arguments that sort of gild the lily of human existence and keep us from living our full life. And he generated a lot of opposition along the way from with regard to his philosophy, which he didn't shy away from. He had some great supporters, among them his lifelong love, Simone de Beauvoir, who herself towering figure in philosophy and had a huge influence on the social sciences and in particular feminist philosophy. Her work, The Second Sex, is one of the elements of the feminist canon in philosophy. Just tremendous work. And Sartre was always there for Simone de Beauvoir. So he kind of walked the walk, the existential walk of commitment. When de Beauvoir was sick, he dropped everything, all his projects, and just devoted himself to getting her back to health. And she, for her part, when Sartre, the critiques of Sartre's philosophy came in, and they were fierce, let me tell you. She wrote one of the great defenses of philosophy ever written, uh, against what she called pseudo-Sartreanism. So, really strong supporter. And Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre collaborated on lots of different projects. He was also immensely involved, a political person. He, was involved in all the politics of his day. Interestingly, along with Bertrand Russell, who was at the complete other end of the philosophical spectrum, they wrote a joint philosophical letter, moral letter, an ethical letter, criticizing the Vietnam War. And so it's kind of an interesting snapshot of the kind of individual that Sartre was. So early on in life, he was really struck with the idea that there's something interesting about reality, right? I can look at the day right now, and it's kind of a wintry day. It's the leaves are gone now, and all of the black and white features in the landscape are very prominent. It's kind of stark in a way. It's a wintry day. And so I would say, well, that the interesting thing about this is that's not in your head. We tend to think of everything as happening as, a processing unit in our head. The light hits the cones in our eyes, and that goes to the machinery in our head and stuff like that. And phew, we have a wintry day. Sartre argues, look, that's not how it happens. There's a prior level to our existence whereby we pay attention to things initially. And there's that attention that we have to things is primordial. It's before our analysis kicks in. And so for sure, I see the wintry day. It's really a wintry day. It's not in my head. Now I might have associations, psychological associations with the wintry day, ex post facto, after the fact, as we say. But that's not my initial experience of reality. My initial experience of reality is what one Sartre scholar, McCulloch, calls direct realism. I love things because, in fact, they are lovable. It's not in my head. I loathe other things because they are truly loathsome. It's not in my head. Now, after the fact, I might, process this differently in my psychology. I might have associations of one kind or another. But for Sartre, the evidence for direct realism is pretty irrefutable. And I can talk myself out of my direct realism, of course. I can put filters of every sort in there to hide this from, but the fact remains I have direct access to reality. The other interesting feature about his philosophy is, of course, what we talked about earlier, which is the idea of consciousness. Sartre argues that our consciousness is actually not in our head only, it's actually in the world, it's amongst things. It's by the stream, it's by the river, it's by the tree, it's by the computer. And it's kind of decentered would be one word, but it's active, it's overflowing, it's spontaneous, it's moving, it's anything but static. And for Sartre, that sets up a little bit of a problem for us, doesn't it? Because when we find out that we look around the world and we see cups, saucers, pictures, photos, paintings, mugs, all these different things, we know immediately that we're not that. It's sort of like the old Sesame thing, Street thing. Which one of these things is not like the other? Well, for Sartre, it's our consciousness, because it's not a thing, it's nothing. Why is it nothing? Well, it's nothing because it has no content of its own. In order for us to experience the world directly, Sartre argues, consciousness can't have any kind of texture or content of its own. Otherwise, that would be another filter on reality. And, the tree can't enter into my head. None of this stuff can happen. So my consciousness has no content other than what it's conscious of. That's scary. It's really scary, because what it means is that my life is essentially groundless, but for whatever it is that I'm conscious of. Now, I can talk myself into all kinds of fanciful things after the fact, but I'm just doing what Sartre would criticize, and that's playing myself. I play myself whenever I start to think that I'm something like a table, a stone, a chair, an object of some sort. Yes, I do have a thing-like component to my existence, my objectivity, if you will, my body. But that's not me, right? That's my consciousness is actually in my body. When I go to open a door, I intuitively know that the door handle is for turning. Um, and I can also turn my hand into a stone if I want to negate someone's handshake, right? I can turn it into a piece of wood so it's lifeless and hard and cold. On the other hand, I can infuse it with my consciousness and be warm and open and supportive in a hug, right? For example. So my consciousness determines everything here. My subjectivity does. But it's not a subjectivity like, in psychology. Not to say psychology is wrong in any way. It's just that it's one order removed from our initial experience of reality, which is direct and which involves our consciousness amongst things. Sartre's predecessor in French philosophy, René Descartes, had a very famous statement that he put forth at the end of his reflections on reality. And it was in Latin, of course, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And Sartre liked this. It's very compelling. But he said that, Descartes was half right. It should be, I am, therefore I think. So his thesis really is that existence famously precedes essence. I don't have I don't have an identity, or I'm not a something, and then I exist. No, I exist first in the first order, and then I take on these different, aspects, roles, identities, and so forth. It's challenging for me to recognize that I'm not a thing, that I'm free vis-a-vis all the objects in the world, and that I have this incredible ability to choose. As Viktor Frankl said, it sets up the prescription for regret and guilt, because every choice involves the negation of another choice. You know, when a person leaves their family to get married, or to be with someone else, well, that has consequences for the family. I'm losing my little boy, I'm losing my girl, whatever the case may be. It's something, and it has consequences, and we know that. And hence, for Sartre, guilt, depression, anxiety, these emotions are built into the human condition. They're not just stuff that's in our head. And there's no way around. Well, there is a way around. Let me catch myself there. And it's a very destructive way. Sartre would have us understand that fear is a very big part of the human condition. And that's really at the crux of his analysis of anti-Semitism. Why are we afraid? Well, we're afraid because we know in our heart of hearts that we're not one of these things that we see in reality. We're not an object. And that freaks us out. And some people, it really, really freaks out, because they want that solidity, you see, they want that permanence that comes from an object. If you go by the shoreline in Connecticut, you'll see these wonderful, deep, ancient granite stones everywhere, right? And all around New England, you go up to Armonk or upstate to New Paltz, you see these granite cliffs, and my God, they're so hard and old, and even within the rocks, there's even deeper ages in there. Well, we want to be like that. We want to be like a stone, because we want to have that kind of permanence and solidity, but it's not us. It's not who we are. We're dependent on objects for the content of our consciousness, but we don't have that. We're consciousness. We're radically free. We're spontaneous. You can right now look around spontaneously at whatever you choose to look at, or you can think about whatever you choose you want to think about, right? And because we can't think of two things at once. Okay, I'm going to try it right now. I'm going to try thinking of two things at once. Nah, didn't work. Okay. So look, that scares us. And there are a lot of things that people do. And one of the things that people do when they have this encounter with existence and the human condition is they kind of dig their heels in, and they want to establish a ground. See, I am this, and the ground of my existence is I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a student. See, that's who I am. I got my feet planted solidly on the ground like a thing, like a tree. Okay. And we can kind of hide our existential freedom from ourselves when we do that, because we're pretending, we're playing pretend. Let's pretend that we're a tree or a stone, but we know we're not. But how do I do that? What do I do? How do I establish myself as a thing so that I escape from this, the terror of the human condition? Well, I define myself as a something, as I said, a Democrat, Republican, this or that, Aryan, as in the case of the Nazis or something. But what's implied by that? If I establish the ground of my existence in terms of one of these identities, right? What do I need to do? Well, I need to say that I'm this, but I need to validate by saying, I'm this, but you're that. See, you're not what I am. It's kind of like Freud's the narcissism of minor difference. I find something, and this is now I've turned myself into a stone, you see, but it comes at the price of turning you into something worse. Because now you're the other, but not just the other, like, you know, there is the social construction of the other, right? If, if two countries are at war, you can have one side or the other commit horrible atrocities against the other because they first convinced themselves that the other is an enemy. Okay, so the other is not like me, the other is an other. So it's kind of like the social construction of the other. And we see it go on all the time in society and in politics and in the military, of course, and in everywhere, right? So the social construction. But Sartre says, look, maybe there's a deeper level to this business of the other. And it's in this level that he locates anti-Semitism. And he says something quite astounding in Anti-Semite and Jew, his major work on this philosophy of the other. He says that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with the Jews. So right off the bat, that's kind of a curious thing. Well, what do you mean? That's the meaning of anti-Semitism. Well, it's not about the Jews, because what it's about is the fear that the anti-Semite has. They're afraid of the human condition, this existential freedom, which is a horrible burden. Let's just say it. When you're told that you're responsible for everything and that there are no excuses, that's a frightening place to be. And so Sartre writes that in the face of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish you as an other, and that's going to make me feel better about my identity. Because you see, I'm an Aryan, you see, and this is who I am. Now, along the way, Sartre's study of anti-Semitism is kind of interesting because he critiques a lot of the behavioral approaches to this, and all the ideologies that go along with it. We have an expression sometimes we use, well, that's the excuse, or that's not the reason, or some version of that, right? The implication is that, well, the stated cause is not the actual reason for the thing. And people do this all the time. They won't really come clean with, what it is they're actually doing. So that we'll say stuff, no, we won't, but people will say stuff like, well, the Jews, this is one of the things he talks about, it's a famous canard, the Jews killed Christ, as if that's the reason for anti-Semitism. And Sartre said, look, that's a statement. You can talk about it, a lot of countervailing evidence to that. Christianity is founded in Judaism, and all the rest. And, certainly, Judaism is revered by the Islamic faith as well. We all share certain books of the Bible, all that sort of thing. But it's a canard as an excuse because it doesn't get to the issue, right? It's not really what's going on. It's as if some historical thing had happened, and this just keeps repeating itself. Well, there is a historical root to this, and it is the human condition, whereby the fear of existence generates these kind of social pathologies at a very deep level. But it's not the Jews who killed Christ. It's, or some of these other narratives. Or, one of the other ones he criticizes is the idea that, well, the Jews are too forward-leaning in society. They're too active in politics, you see, as if, the Jews, it has nothing to do with that, as Sartre argues. It has to do with the anti-Semite is afraid of everything, he argues. They're afraid of everything. The one thing they're not afraid of is Jews, because they're just a foil for them to escape from the fear they have about themselves. And so they play this bad faith, what Sartre calls bad faith game, where they try to hide the real truth about themselves from themselves and, establish their identity on the basis of someone else. Um, there are other wrinkles to this in the social and historical order, the Jewish faith with its emphasis on law also, establishes kind of an interesting sort of uh, universal code that cuts against the idea, the privileged place of identity for the anti-Semite. So that, the idea that one would have to be accountable to a universal law is deeply hostile to the kind of identity games that anti-Semites play as they hide the human condition, hide from the human condition. Sartre received a lot of criticism for this. There have been several publications which, took issue. I would say the majority of them are, really don't, they're behavioral in their approach, and they don't really accept the deep ethics that Sartre is advancing in Anti-Semite and Jew. But he certainly has, really clarified the air quite a bit, I think, with his takedown. Because today, even today, you hear that the commentary and politicians and news reporters will constantly say, well, this generated this response, and that's responsible for the rise of anti-Semitism. No, the sociological rise for anti-Semitism, I think you could argue, is probably, the rapid change that, societies are undergoing, and how that threatens traditional ideas of human identity and traditional sources of authority. And so, sadly, there's a kind of raison d'etre to bad faith, and so, anytime an individual can escape from freedom, um, which is a burden. Remember, we're not talking about, going, like a freely spinning wheel freedom. We're talking about freedom that comes with, as Viktor Frankl said, these three aspects of it: pain, guilt, and loss. And, it's somewhat understandable that people would try to escape from that or hide it from themselves. So it's interesting. It's in many ways, and commentators have noted this, Sartre's philosophy of existence is kind of an alternative or an adjunct or a supplement, if you want, to Freud's idea of repression, right? In Freud, you find the idea of, uh, displacement and sublimation. People, experience of pain, he writes, in civilization and its discontents, and they kind of transfer that on to something else or some group or someone else. And in Sartre, it's not a lateral move, transference or sublimation. It's a move at a deeper level where I try to bury my freedom from my conscious self. But of course, how can anyone hide, as the ancient philosopher Heraclitus said, from that which never sets? So I'm going to stop here, and I hope you enjoyed this little discussion of anti-Semite and Jew. And we'll meet again on Thursday, probably online, and talk then. Otherwise, let's see. There are just a couple of other things I wanted to just get at.